Hi, this is Lindy Kaiser with clearancejobs.com. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar with Janus Research Group. We are so excited to be having this conversation, to be talking with Dr. Douglas Maxwell and Colonel John Barry, commander of the Army Training Support Center. This is an interactive webinar, so as we go through, we are open to taking your questions, both about the Army simulation and training mission, as well as career opportunities with Janus Research Group. So if you have a question, your line is muted, but throughout the webinar, if you go to the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, you can type in your question. If we do not get to your question today, we will certainly follow up later. So we again encourage any questions that you might have about Army training simulation, about careers in simulation and training, or the other topics that we get to today. We just again encourage you to type in your questions so we have the chance to engage with you and interact in that way. So again, I'm so appreciate your time, Colonel Barry, for taking the time to be with us, and also to Dr. Douglas Maxwell. I know your schedules are certainly very busy, so we love these opportunities to engage and interact with candidates and have the opportunity for folks who might be interested in career tracks or just in general want to know what it's like to work in this area and to support this really vital mission. So appreciate your time. So I kind of wanted to start and just kind of talk about Janus Research Group and the role of simulation-based training. So can you kind of kick us off, Dr. Maxwell, to address that?
Yeah, sure can. So Janus Research is headquartered in Evans, Georgia, but we support sites all over the world, and we also have remote workers all across the United States. We are primarily an engineering and technical services company with about 600 employees, not counting our subcontractors. Some of our core competencies are capabilities integration for the military, research and development, software development, engineering, of course, model-based engineering. We do analysis and experimentation, not just from a doctrinal standpoint, such as with future studies program, but also from a scientific standpoint. We do logistics, we do training, and we do a lot of cyber-related work. We are organized into 4 business units. The first business unit is the C2S2, or the Combat Capabilities Systems Engineering Solutions Group. The business unit leader is going to be proud of me for getting that right the first time. That's where the majority of our cyber work is located. We have a cyber defense group that specializes in things like risk management framework and network defense. We have capabilities integration and sustainment solutions group. That business unit, CIS2, is mostly program management and acquisition, capability development, as well as logistics and IT support, again, for military customers. Our Mission and Training Solutions Group, MTS, that business unit, is where things start to get interesting for me as a scientist, because that's where, you know, the bulk of our M&S activities take place. It's where our data analysis and visualization folks reside. Also, it's where it's where augmented reality and virtual reality solutions are developed for our Army customers. And then most recently, Janus Research acquired Cape Henry Associates, and they're our 4th business unit now, focusing primarily on our Navy customers. And again, they get really interesting for me too, because they get into data sciences. That's where the bulk of our AI and machine learning research is going on right now, in machine vision and AR and VR training applications for the Navy. And then also they do curriculum development and training applications. So the company as a whole is around 25 years old. We just celebrated an anniversary, and it's going strong, and it's really a pleasure to work for them.
Love that. And now, Colonel Barry, I wanted to talk from your vantage point. We're obviously here to talk kind of about the Army Training Support Center and also simulation-based training. So what kind of work is the Army doing in this area, and why does the Army do simulation-based training? And I think you had a slide too to support that, if I can pull up here if you wanted me to.
No, Lindy, we can put up the slide later. First, I would like to just take a few moments and just introduce myself to the crowd, just so they know who I am, who I'm talking to, and then I'll jump into why the Army does simulation-based training. First of all, I truly appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon to discuss one of my favorite things, simulations. And it's always a pleasure to be speaking with one of my good friends, Dr. Maxwell. So it's always good to see you online there, Doug. And of course, our audience. Well, first, I have almost 28 years of service to the Army in uniform. And I've been working in simulations for the past 20 years to include both training and experimentation. I know Doug kind of mentioned experimentation a little bit, and just so that our audience is tracking, there is six communities, and training by far is the largest. And outside of the actual training audience, as in uniformed soldiers, I work mostly with Army civilian professionals, ACPs, and government contractors such as Janus. I know that, Doug, you mentioned RMF, and Janus had the contract when I used to work experimentation down at Arctic, which is now Future Center. So very well versed of what Janus does, and I appreciate the opportunity again to talk to you. However, I do want to comment that the last 5 years of my 20 years being in simulation, my collaboration has extended to our industry partners and academia with the sole purpose to advance, the Army simulation-based training capability. And I'm well versed and excited about today's topic, and hopefully that comes across. And in a nutshell, simulation-based training is pivotal in creating and maintaining our readiness. And when I speak of readiness, it is to execute the Army mission. And what I tell people, the Army, we're charged with one thing, and that is to win our nation's wars. So, back to Lindy's question, why do the Army execute simulation-based training? Well, to start answering that question, I'm going to reach back to a quote from Douglas MacArthur. And for those that attended West Point, you may have had to memorize this phrase. And it goes something like this: upon the fields of friendly strife are sown the seeds that on other days, on other fields, will bear the fruits of victory. And that phrase typically means reference sports fields, but it also applies to training. And then speaking of training, nothing can replace the blood, sweat, and tears during live training exercises. The real life experiences and stresses of live training improves the readiness level and competence of our service members. However, there are many instances where live training is impractical, and these are due to cost, safety, or availability. And to compensate for these limitations, simulation offers a viable augmentation to live training. A few benefits of simulation training include immediate feedback, it's repeatable, and it reduces the risk of dangerous maneuvers. Now, if you do have that slide handy, I think this is probably a good time to pop it up, where it kind of articulates what I just mentioned in a little bit more detail when I talk about simulation-based training for immediate feedback and being repeatable and reduces, putting the soldiers in harm's way.
Got it, sir.
Is it being shown, or?
It's up.
Oh, it's up? Okay, I can't see it. So I do know what the slide says. So at the very top, it says, why simulation-based training? And it goes, all but war is simulation. And what does that mean? I believe it was STRICOM that originally coined that phrase. And STRICOM, which is simulation training and instrumentation, which is now PEO STRI. And so it basically says that everything we do in the Army gears us to actually execute war. And so, as I talked about, well, simulations, it's a training tool and prepares the service member to execute our mission. And if you see number 2, it says repetition, iteration, not under fire. Fight the 25 bloodless battles. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. It's in quote, 25 bloodless battles. For those that are familiar with retired General Mattis, he was Secretary of Defense, and he used that term to describe our combat forces. Before we put them in harm's way, they need to do these repetitions. They need to execute that mission at least 25 times in simulation before we put them out there in the field to fight our enemies and adversaries. And I know I touched on training, tactical operations, strategic problem sets, things that we just can't do in live training. For example, you're not going to put a core online. You're not going to put, the service component. It's able to execute what we need to do. And one of the things that I can speak confident on is experimentation. One of the things that we also do simulation for is executing things in the future, things that we don't have those capabilities. So what we do is we have a lot of agencies that template out what our adversary is going to look like, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and we put those capabilities to what we think our capabilities will be in order to address where's the shortfall. At what point are we overmatched to what we think our adversaries will have, 10, 20, 30 years from now. And from that builds us requirements, which then enables us to execute what we need to do. And I know the topic is, simulation-based training through 2035. And I think that's a great topic, because not only are we worried about training today's fight, but also tomorrow's fight. And I'll leave it at that. There's a lot of things that are coming down the pike that I know both myself and Dr. Maxwell have been part of and working through, and pretty much revamping of the way that we actually conduct training. Training is still training, we still execute. The purpose of training is to change behavior. And we're able to do that either through repetition or through building a presence in that person that we want to change that behavior to. I know I was a little long-winded, but I'll pause there and not to monopolize our time.
It was perfect. I love the passion. You can't replicate that. You both have it, and they're bringing it from your different perspectives, and that's what we love to hear. So Dr. Maxwell, can you talk a little bit about, so you teased this a little bit, Colonel Barry, saying, especially in the past 5 years, you have had a lot of opportunities to partner with industry in this mission. So how does that look practically in the work that you're doing, Dr. Maxwell?
So when you're talking about simulation-based training, let's discuss a little bit of history. So back in the 30s and 40s, we started with the flight simulators. The U.S. Mail Service figured out that they could save a lot of pilots' lives if they trained them how to fly before giving them a plane. And it sounds obvious today for us to train pilots before putting them in a cockpit, but back then, it was a new thing. And so they developed something called a link trainer, which was a little box, that had all the flight controls, and they taught people how to fly. Fast forward to the 1980s. The military adopted simulation-based training for vehicles. They did it for flight. They did it for operation of equipment that was, basically within arm's reach. And they had great success because it was pretty obvious if someone understood and were quote unquote trained. And the military equated a number of hours with a certain standard that someone would meet before they would be considered qualified. What we're finding today is that things are a little bit different, especially when you're dealing with cognitive skills. So when you're talking about adoption of virtual training or constructive simulation-based training, in addition to live training, you have to make sure that that someone has learned something before you move them on and consider them the stamp of approval. And the way you do that is through measurement. So instead of just giving them a certain amount of hours in a training system and then putting them in a truck and they can drive it, when you're dealing with cognitive skills, someone has to demonstrate that they understand what is going on. One misfire that we saw in the application of virtual training was in the 90s and early 2000s, someone realized that team play in video games promoted, collective training skills, and that they were right, they did. But it still is to be decided today how you measure that. So just having someone running around in Doom or running around in VBS, practicing, it's unclear how much good or how much they are learning, although we do know that they are learning something. What's going on is we had too much success with the vehicle trainers, and we had too much success with the flight simulators, because it was fairly straightforward to create a training system that could teach someone, how to fly with proper replicated physics and controls, how to drive something. But when it comes to soft skills, and I'm particularly talking about infantry training skills, where the environment has to properly stimulate people so that they can make decisions. And a big part of how the infantry does their job is they have to understand what's happening to them. If they're being shot at, they have to know, is it from near fire or from far fire? If they're being mortared, they have to be able to understand that they've got incoming, indirect fire. If they're going to do things that require soft skills like key leader engagement, all of this has to be trained, but you can't use the same kind of simulation approaches that had been used in the past. So today, we're looking at building higher fidelity desktop simulators, as well as augmented and virtual reality simulators that can do a better job of stimulating the people who are recreating, what we call battle drills, and observing them and observing their reactions through telemetry, the way that they behave after they've been stimulated. Is the squad leader calling the correct command, for example? Do people understand their land nav skills, and are they going the right direction? One of the funniest things I've ever seen in a live training event was when a squad leader called for someone to move in a direction, but everyone knew what the individual meant, and they all went in the wrong or the opposite direction they called, but they still understood each other. And so those are some weirdisms that you see in live training that I have not seen replicated in virtual training yet. I think today, with the introduction of better computing systems, we have more powerful computers today than we did, even 5 and 10 years ago. We have the ability to leverage cloud infrastructures, so you don't have to put an entire data center on site, for example. We have better networks, but more importantly, we have better reasoning capabilities in an automated sense. And so implementing commercially available off-the-shelf machine learning and artificial intelligence is really a game changer that I see happening, not just the past, say, 18 months or so, but going forward over the next 5 years. And so what I would like to see in what Colonel Barry mentioned previously is better readiness estimation at a higher fidelity. So you have units, they're using their simulation-based training. Telemetry and student surveillance is happening in an automated sense, so that a larger volume of information about the individual is being collected and then processed, so that individualized training can then be created for those trainees. And then their readiness assessment is performed also in an automated fashion, but at a higher fidelity and reliability. I would like to caveat this, though, that the commanders and the training managers will always have an override. So we can't guarantee that the machines will always be perfect. So this is more of a decision support stance than it is a decision replacement stance. So we just need to be careful to caveat that. All But War simulation is kind of like a bumper sticker that is all over our community. It was above the high bay at the office that I worked at the Army Research Lab. We will probably always strive to make simulation better in some way, either the physics or the in a training context, making the simulations higher fidelity or more realism. If you want, we can talk about the Valley of the uncanny valley at some point. So we have to be careful about realism there. But this is an exciting time to be in the community. And the funny thing is every time I do a webinar like this over the past 20 years or so, I always say this is a really interesting time to be in the community. So it seems to be not just building momentum, but getting the changes are in a positive direction, I believe.
No, it's definitely exciting to see this technology, which has been around a long time now. I mean, it's not a new phenomenon across the military training community, but to see, I'm sure it looks completely different than it did, 15 years ago when I was working for the Army. I love your example too, that you don't, is there hope for me with Army Command that you cannot know the difference between left and right and find yourself trying to give people directions somewhere? Cause that's going to throw me off. Libby, I wanted to bring you in a little bit because we talk about skills for this. If you're willing, if you're game, because you're a media specialist with Janus Research Group, and so you're dealing with all these things. So can you talk about kind of some of the skills vectors that you see from your vantage point for those candidates coming in for that candidate piece?
Yeah, so just to introduce myself a little bit, since this is my intro, but I'm the marketing media specialist with Janus Research Group. So I cover a wide range of things at Janus. So whether that be marketing or PR or design purposes, I am here to serve Janus for that. But a lot of what we do also is I work very tightly knit with the HR team. And what we are always trying to do as far as, speaking with and sourcing candidates is really try to kind of dive into what it is that we need for our clients or those that we are clients or projects that we are trying to source. So we always have a very tight communication with our potential candidates or candidates that we're speaking with about specifically simulation-based or engineering-based projects. You can find us on our website, you can find us on LinkedIn, you can find us on our clearance job site as well. So there are a lot of ways to get in touch with us. But yeah, our HR team is a fantastic point of contact for any of that, which you can find all of those POCs on our website.
Yeah, and we will follow up after the webinar and make sure they have that information too, so you can certainly be in touch. And I want to pivot to you, Colonel Barry, on a bit of the uncanny valley piece, or maybe speak to that. So, what are some of the limitations of simulation-based training, and also what are some of the opportunities if you're game?
No, absolutely. So, not necessarily uncanny valley. For example, you can train negative behaviors within simulation. So as Dr. Maxwell mentioned, SimNet, two things that he mentioned, the link trainer and the SimNet pretty much revolutionized simulations for training. One of the big pieces with the SimNet, as he talked about collective training, is what SimNet did was it put the crew as the center for the training vice the actual device. And so we were able to actually win, if you will, in 1990, the war with Iraq. Although none of our crews had maneuvered before in their lives, they were able to be very successful. A very famous battle for those that study any kind of history or any kind of tank battle, the Battle of 73 Hastings, where 2 regiment brigades were defeated by 4 American troops. Was basically, the odds are from 1 to 8. And not only were we victorious, it was overwhelming victorious. However, with that being said, so what kind of negative behaviors that we also have to be cautious of? I think Dr. Maxwell mentioned, you get the kids behind the video games and you establish an expectation. For example, the visual cues that when you destroyed something within SimNet, you saw a fireball, you saw smoking. So during the actual war, gunners kept firing at the enemy until they saw these explosions. And then as we collected, the BDA, realizing 1 round would have done the kill, they didn't need to continue the firing. But they were taught within the SimNet, within that virtual trainer, if you will, that collective training, as they're honing their skills, hey, it's not over until I see an explosion, until I see that turret, fly up and spin in the air a couple of times. So those are things we've got to be careful. And I also, touch on, based on, hey, realism. So one of the things that I know that kind of hit on the point, why do we do simulation-based training? It comes to, we want to change behavior. And some of that behavior is either changed, based on the fidelity of the actual simulation. And of course, we've always taught more fidelity, the better, right? We want it to smell, feel, what we're doing. However, there's a limit. There's a limitation of how much research dollars, how much equipment, how much technology can we actually afford. We are, I am, subject to, to the taxpayer. So I have to make sure that what we're spending on training is what we need and no more. And so as we talk about fidelity, fidelity is great. We need to have fidelity, but do we need to have the physical fidelity, or do we make sure we concentrate on the psychological fidelity? And that's where some of the things that we got to make sure. Physically, yes, we got to make sure the form fit is correct, the buttonology, but we also have to make sure the psychology part of it's right. And what do I mean by that? Meaning that they have that presence, that there's consequences to that individual, that crew making decisions on the spot in the heat of the battle. So when it comes time to perform, there's no hesitation.
Yeah, and you mentioned,
I'll leave it at that.
Well, you mentioned the cost savings too. Now, I mean, maybe I'm dating myself, but that is something we used to, our military and Army used to tout, that like, if you want to compare, obviously building this technology is not cheap, but compare it to live training and the costs associated with that. And there are opportunities for the government, especially at scale, to be able to save money by using simulation-based training. True or false?
Very, very true. So before I entered the military, not too far beyond, we used to do these exercises in Europe called reforgers, where we had the divisions online conducting maneuvers. We don't do that now. Well, why don't we do that? Well, it's cost prohibitive. Not only is it cost prohibitive, it's also against the policies in place with agreements between the countries of the U.S. and those in Europe. It won't allow us to do that. So then how do we train those corps commanders, those division commanders, brigade commanders? And we do that through simulation. I know Doug kind of mentioned, constructive simulation, and that's what we do. And I will just take a step back, based on our audience. I don't know how much they know about live, virtual, constructive. An easy way that I remember it, if you're conducting simulation training, live training, it's using real people, using real equipment. And the reason it's simulation training, because more likely it's been instrumented. So we get that feedback, we get that skill card or that kill card. And so then what's virtual training? LVC. Virtual training is real people using fake equipment, i.e. it's a simulator. It's not a real tank. It's not a real helicopter. So then what's constructive? Well, constructive is fake people using fake equipment. And the whole intent of that is to do that collective training, that higher echelon training, where you want to exercise those core decisions, those division, the brigades, the battalions, and making sure those systems are in place. The benefit of constructive simulation is to stimulate the mission command systems, which control the battle on the battlefield. And without those practices, we don't know. You never want to test out your systems, when you're facing your adversary. Mm-hmm. And so, what's a cheap way to do it other than entering a war? All but war simulation. You conduct those warfighter exercises.
Love it. And so talk a little bit, Dr. And you can certainly add to that, Dr. Maxwell, but also talk to, there's huge competition across these skill sets from a civilian hiring perspective and also for military. So kind of what sets Janus Research Group apart, or why for folks who maybe have those broad skill sets that could be applied to a simulation-based training mission, is this a really valuable career track to pursue?
Sure. Constructive simulation has always reminded me of a very elaborate game of Risk, or a very serious game of D&D. So I like the math component of the constructive sims. When it comes to simulation and simulation-based training, it's truly multidisciplinary. So when you get into the formal experimentation, I mean, everyone from historians to engineers are involved. When it comes to making very realistic or valued virtual sims, you need cognitive psychologists and user interface experts in there to make sure that the information is presented correctly. I like that simulation is variable in its fidelity, and what I mean by that is when you're training flight simulation, you want the highest fidelity flight sim possible, including all the multiple degrees of motion, and the physics is correct. But when you're training collective multi-mission type training, or when you're training for a mission, really all you need to do is line up two desks, one in front of each other, and someone gets to pretend like they're the pilot, someone gets to pretend like they're the navigator or the weapons specialist, and then you get crews together and you can work through the mission that way, but you're still doing it in a simulated fashion. And then you've got the whole range of desktop simulators to medium fidelity to high fidelity simulators. And so it really is picking the best tool for the job. Today is much different than it was 20 years ago because security is such a high emphasis. We have a hard time, in fact, connecting simulators together sometimes, not because of any technical challenges, but because of risk management policy and what networks are available to us. Janus has really carved out a niche there in expertise in information technology all the way through the engineering portion. I know that it's probably not as focused an answer as you had wanted, but I enjoy going to large training events and learning about all the different backgrounds of the individuals who are involved. At Fort Polk, the last time I was there, I met someone who had a background in theater. Well, that makes sense because of all the live training and the kind of like the Hollywood set that was created there. So it makes total sense. But you run into people with robotics backgrounds. You run into people with artificial intelligence backgrounds. This is a field where I look forward in interacting with new graduates because their knowledge in some areas is much fresher, much newer than mine. And so pairing the new graduates with the graybeard and journeyman engineers, you really can create magic.
No, I love that. I love the theater background too, because it's absolutely, I mean, a lot of those training and simulation opportunities, I mean, the attention to detail down to attire is significant, and it takes someone with kind of that detailed orientation to do that. We had a great question come in from Nicholas. I appreciate that he asked it like 3 times. The first 2 times like full of acronyms. Then he was like, this moderator is probably an idiot. She's not going to know what I'm talking about. So then he pared down his question to, how are the Army and the Marine Corps potentially working together on some of these simulation-based training initiatives? I think it fits in well with just in general, how do the service branches, is there a coordination across that? And maybe even I'm curious, I mean, that is sometimes where industry and other partners can come in because they can kind of partner with different organizations or leverage a technology, and you will see it used across different service branches. So I don't know who wants to take that one. I mean, Army is clearly better than the Marine Corps. Let's just get.
Lindy, absolutely. I mean, that's all we need to hear, right?
I mean,
I'll take a stab at it first. So, is there coordination between the services? Absolutely. And there's an organization in place for that. We have the Joint Staff 7, Joint Service 7 out in Virginia. And so that's what they're charged to do. And as a matter of fact, the Vice Chief of Staff is actually, basically pushing that envelope to make interoperability between the services a reality, Vice, a big hand wave. So why does the Vice have to step in to do that? Because it comes down to funding. So we create what we're funded for, and no more, nothing less. And so unless there's joint funding, there's really no a forcing function for the services to interoperate. Now, with that being said, the Joint Force does have a budget. They do run joint exercises, and it's during these exercises we see there's issues. For example, Air Force, they are more platform centric, where Marines and Army are more unit driven. And so how do you get those PDUs, those packets, those HLA, talking back and forth? And I'm throwing those acronyms out just to make Dr. Maxwell, smile a little bit. And for those that don't know, we actually sat in the same class together at advanced degree, studying simulation. So I do know what those mean. But as we're going through, and as and as I mentioned, funding is always an issue, but it's also to stimulate and to force that, cross-service interoperability. The lack of funding is actually making us do it more, because we don't have the funds to make an Army system, to make a Marine system, to make an Air Force system. For all the exercises that we run, not only are they joint now, they are also multinational. So bringing in our multinational partners, it truly becomes a policy issue. Because I mentioned before when I was talking about constructive simulations. Constructive simulations are designed to stimulate the Army's mission command systems, which all reside secret, no foreign, because that's what controls, how we see the, enemy, how we target the enemy, and how do we actually launch steel on target. So all those are really guarded in the way we do that. So going back to, the gentleman's question, is the Army Marine, are they working simulations together? Absolutely. We have been doing that for at least the last 15 years. We have constructive simulations that we built together, ones that are cross-cutting. And one of the things that we have changed as we're getting smarter, nothing against our industry partners, because our industry partners want to be part of every time there's a change. They want to be part of that change because they have a bottom line to meet. But as we're noticing that with the military, the government is doing is we want all our simulations to be open source code, so we can bring in those other systems from other services. For example, I'm talking about Air Force. Air Force, we use their simulation. Awesome. Air War Simulation Battle. Boom, we use that. The Marines, MTWAS, we use their simulations, because their proponent level simulations, into the joint exercises. And yeah, and I'll leave it at that. Yes, we are doing the cross service interoperability, more so now than we have ever been, not because we're getting more funding, it's because we're getting less funding.
Yep.
Anything else on that, Dr. Maxwell, or how you partner with different groups, maybe, or stakeholders?
Yeah. So the policy and the funding is probably the driver there. And on the contractor side, so we're kind of like the action officers. One thing that Janus does is a lot of interoperability work. And so we do integration of different systems under some of our tasking. And if the systems were developed in stovepipes, then that makes the integrator's job much, much more difficult. So there's something called the MOSA, the Modular Open Systems Approach, and that specifies, and this is from a DoD instruction, that systems are to be developed using open standards. And so that could be everything from an application protocol interface that's published and is correct. We want to respect everyone's intellectual property. So if you have a piece of software, you could still wrap it up in a library that's not accessible to the public, but the interfaces to that library need to be well documented and correct, so that when you plug the library into a system of systems, it behaves in predictable manners. We definitely see more and more convergence with the Marine systems. There's an office here in Orlando called PM Traces, which is the Marine Corps' PM for training systems, and they work very closely with our program executive office in the Army called STRI, Simulation, Training, and Instrumentation, and they talk. And you can tell that they talk based on their requests for information and their requests for proposals, and the way that they leverage their acquisition powers, and it's really, really good. The government is modernizing with its approach to software development. So when I was in government, we were taught that there's an approach called waterfall, and that was a way that you not just manage but develop software, and that's kind of an old way of thinking. Now there's something called a software acquisition pathway, which gives the government and the acquisition folks top cover to use agile development processes, should they choose to. Please choose to. And so it's a more modern way of approaching not just software development, but also management. Yeah, we covered policy, we covered some doctrine, and then we covered some practical applications, not just through the acquisition side, but also through the software development side. A few weeks ago, I was at a NATO modeling and simulation summit, and probably the theme that ran through all the representative countries was interoperability and standardization. And so, as you can imagine, American technology will be introduced more and more into Europe, over the next upcoming years. And our NATO partners, our European partners, don't want to be consumers, and they don't want to be simply driven by standardization or standards that Americans derive. They want to be partners in this. And so you're probably going to see more and more, not just American service cooperation, but also at the international level as well.
Awesome. We're already getting near to our time where we have to conclude. So I definitely want to make sure folks know if you have questions and we don't get to them, still drop them into the chat box so we can follow up with you afterwards. So if there are any other questions that folks have, last chance, type in your questions now. You guys clearly have some personal passion points around this career track, which I always love. So kind of, can you talk about the more rewarding aspect of working in a simulation and training mission? I'll start with you, Colonel Barry.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned in my intro, if you will, that outside of the actual training audience, outside once you get out of the uniform, majority of the people I deal with is civilians or government contractors. And why is that? As Dr. Maxwell was pretty much discussing, making sure that we get the policies correct, making sure we want new engineers, new way of thinking how to deliver these training capabilities. And knowing that some of the work that you've done will actually, result in a new capability that your government will use. And as you can tell, as I was beginning, at the end of the day, it comes down to one thing. We're all part of the team, and that one team is to ensure that we win our nation's war. And so everything we do to bending code, to making sure that the mission command systems working great, ultimately goes down to that one piece. And being part of something that's larger than yourself, tell you the truth, I'd be hard pressed to find something that would be more rewarding than that.
And same for you, Dr. Maxwell.
So for me, there's a certain existential pleasure to being an engineer, and that is seeing people use your stuff and it works like it's supposed to. One really transformational moment for me, though, was working with basic leadership skills course trainees, and these are corporals and sergeants, and having them actually use prototypes that we built in my lab, and having them actually demonstrate that they learned and understood something. That's a rush. I mean, that's a drug, and I like to pursue it. That's a lot of fun. But knowing that you've built something and it's doing what it was supposed to do, it may be behaving in ways that are unexpected, but someone is deriving benefit from it, is really, really cool. I simply enjoy interacting with people like Colonel Barry and the other green suiters that I serve, and anything that we can do to make them safer, to make their jobs easier, is really just a lot of fun, and we take great pride in our work.
I love that. Hear that takeaway, engineers? If you want to see your work in action, come work for Janus Research Group. I feel like that's your tagline, because not every engineer gets that opportunity, right? If the work you're doing, you're a lot of time, if you're all in the tech, you don't always see the literal practical application. Here you literally have applications for your work that you get to tangibly see. So I can see how that would be super rewarding, and sounds like something folks should want to be a part of. We know there's technologists looking for career opportunities right now. So if that's you and you're listening to this, sounds like Janus Research Group has a career opportunity for you. Libby or Dr. Maxwell, did you want to touch on that, like application process, if they're on this webinar and they're like, hey, Army simulation, that's something that I'd be interested in. What are good next steps to take? You mentioned it earlier, Libby, but I'm going to make you say it again. Sorry.
No, of course. Yes, so if there's anyone out there that's interested in getting to know more about Janus Research Group and our teams and our open applications, please visit our website at janusresearch.com. You can find all of our social media website links there as well. I encourage you to follow our LinkedIn. We are posting new jobs every single week where you can learn more information about us and what we have available. And if you have any other additional questions, you can reach out to our HR team at recruiting@janusresearch.com. And, you know, I also kind of have to piggyback. I was just thinking when Doug and Colonel Barry were talking, it's so rewarding as a part of Janus Research team to, even though I've never personally dealt in simulation-based training, being a part of the marketing department and just being able to learn new things every single day about this technology and these advancements is incredibly rewarding. So I really, really thank Colonel Barry and Dr. Doug and Lindy and the Clearance Jobs team for indulging us today. It's been a pleasure.
I mean, I could have talked longer. I feel like these guys are super exciting to find out where Colonel Barry and Dr. Maxwell are going to be next, because I think you're going to want to carry on the conversation, because I think we left content on the table, but you always leave them wanting more. I think there's more conversations to be had. But I really appreciate your time. I think it's really important. It sounds like, again, the interagency piece of it, the interoperability piece of it, the ability to collaborate, work together, save taxpayer dollars, and really innovate. Those are all, you know, things to get pretty excited about. And Colonel Barry, Dr. Maxwell, really appreciate your time. Army's the best. We can just end with that, and that's really all. Janus probably can't pick favorites, but I've been bought already, so sorry.
Right.
Army's the best. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time today.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you.